All right, check, check, check. Yep. Eric, you good? All right. And tonight they gave me a stand and a guitar pick. So stick around later. Apparently it's open mic night. But I'm going to put away the guitar pick. So I want to start by reading poetry. I want to start by taking this mask off. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Anybody recognize it? I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. It's Invictus, and it is on every man's top 5 list of poems. Because, especially Americans, because as Americans, we are a self-reliant bunch, and we like to think we're the master of our fate and the captain of our soul. And so is true of our man Jacob. Donald Miller put it this way. He said, "Everyone wants to give charity. No one wants to be charity. No one wants to need charity." And so who does Jacob trust in? Jacob trusts essentially and primarily in Jacob. God is a means to an end, but at the end of the day, Jacob is all about his own cunning, his own brains, his own ingenuity, right? Well, this gospel thing we talk about all the time. What is the gospel? The gospel, in a nutshell, is good news that starts out as very bad news, and we've talked about this a lot. But the bad news is that we and every person who has ever lived are hopelessly broken and lost and dead, the Bible tells us, in trespasses and sins. We are dead. We're broken. Hopelessly so. We're lost, and we can't fix ourselves. But the good news of the gospel is that God, in his mercy, came down to earth, lived the life we couldn't live, died the death on our behalf, and was raised again, and in him we can have transformation and new life, right? So that is the good news. But ultimately, it starts with a very necessary recognition, and that is that we're broken, that we're lost. And so it made me think of a time that my dad and I've told several times this group that my dad and I, so as not to end up the Harry Chapin song, try to get together once a year and do a trip together. And we typically try to find some place that the women in our lives would not have any interest in going. So we've been to Scotland because there was a note in the travel book that said, Scotland doesn't have climate, it has weather, and it's usually going sideways. That seemed like a place that Dad and I would want to go. And one of our trips about 15 years ago was we followed the route of the 101st Airborne from Normandy. No one shot at us there, but we did see Normandy. And then we went across France and up into Remagen, and then down to Bastogne in Belgium, and then on to Berchtesgaden, where Hitler's eagle's nest was. And we just had a great looking at battlefields sort of trip. And early in the trip, when we really were still getting our feet wet on driving a rental car and not speaking any of the language, I assumed confident control of our directions. And so I'm driving the rental car, and Dad says, "I think we want to take the next turn." And I said, no, we need this one. And I looked at the sign, and I confidently said, "I think this is the street we need." And I turned onto the cobblestone street, and I was immediately met with that universal sign of "Go back to America," which was puzzled Frenchmen diving for the doorways. And apparently what I learned that day is that the term, and I wrote it down, piéton seulement, is not the name of a street. It means pedestrians only, which would have been a really important thing to know before I turned and went 30 miles an hour waving happily at all the Frenchmen as I went down the street. No one is as lost as someone who doesn't think they are, is the point. We were lost, but we had no idea. And this is where we find Jacob as we go through tonight's lesson. Jacob is doing pretty well. Jacob is on his way to a bunch of kids. Jacob has a steady job. Jacob is starting tonight, we'll see, to build a sizable herd, which is essentially the Middle Eastern equivalent of a solid portfolio. Jacob is the master of his fate, and he is the captain of his soul, right? And what he really needs, if he's going to enter into a relationship with God, is he needs his feet knocked out from under him. And that's what's going to happen. He needs what they call in AA an intervention. And God is going to give him one tonight. So what we're going to do tonight is go through a pretty sizable chunk. Tonight might be the one night we run 5 or 10 minutes late. I'm going to try. I ran through this a couple of times, and once I finished on time, and the other time it was about 5 or 10 minutes long. So I'll try not to chase any rabbits. And just know that if you can survive tonight, the next 3 are all shorter than an hour and a quarter. So you do get paid back for your attention tonight. So when we left off last week, at the end of chapter 29, Jacob and Leah had 4 children. And this week, the first thing we see in chapter 30 that we're going to cover is them continuing, Jacob and his ladies, continuing to grow the family tree. But not without some good old dysfunction. So in chapter 30, verse 1, it says, "Now when Rachel saw that she had borne Jacob no children, she became jealous of her sister. And she said to Jacob, 'Give me children or I die.'" So little Miss Ugly Eyes, little Miss Weak Eyes is having kids left and right, and Rachel is barren. And Leah is proving to be superior in all the ways that matter in that culture. Leah is doing what a wife is supposed to do, popping out sons. And Rachel isn't used to coming in second. Remember, Rachel's been the favored one her whole life. So how does she respond? She gets mad. She said to Jacob, "Give me children or else I die." Unlike Isaac and Rebekah, who prayed and waited, Rebekah just gets ticked, and Jacob responds to the anger with anger. Verse 2, "Then Jacob's anger burned against Rachel, and he said, 'Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?'" Basically, he says, "I'm doing my part. I've got swimmers. Look, Leah and I are knocking kids out. It must be you. Something's going on with you." So just like Sarah, back with Hagar, if you remember from last fall, Rachel decides to invoke the same custom, the same cultural custom of giving her maid to Jacob and having a child, it says, on her knees, which, remember, was basically that the idea under Hammurabi's law, which existed hundreds of years before this time, the idea was that if you couldn't have children, that your maidservant could be impregnated by your husband, and that she would actually bear the child with you sitting behind her and straddling her, and in all intents and purposes, that child became yours. So she gives her maidservant, Bilhah, in verse 3, said, "Here is my maid Bilhah, go into her that she may bear a child on my knees, that through her I too may have children." So she gave him her maid, Bilhah, and the ploy works. Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Bilhah's name, interestingly enough, means bashful, which is kind of ironic. And Rachel said, "God has vindicated me, and God has indeed heard my voice and has given me a son." So she names the child Dan, which means vindication. And then more kids come, verse 7 and 8. Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, "With mighty wrestlings," the word is Naphtali, "with mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister." So it's all about competition with the sister, basically, which I get a kick out of. And I have indeed prevailed, and she named him Naphtali. So she has been in inner turmoil over her barrenness. And at last, she starts to think, okay, I'm starting to measure up. Now I've had 2 kids, even though they've been by my maid. Interesting that Rachel, even she has her own inner insecurity, that she's competing, that it kind of stood out to me. We talked about Leah and how it must have been to grow up in Rachel's shadow, but it's interesting that everybody has some deep insecurity, some need inside them, even the ones you wouldn't think would. Well, in verse 9, Leah has been watching this and thinks that she's done having children. So she says, two can play that game, and she said when Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took her maid Zilpah. Zilpah means frail. But obviously Zilpah really isn't that frail, because Zilpah starts knocking out children as well. She took her maid Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife, and Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. And Leah said, "How fortunate!" And so she named him Gad. She named him Lucky. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son, and Leah said, "Happy am I, for women will call me happy." So she named him Happy. Happy, happy, joy, joy, happy, lucky. I got a kick out of that. So, however, all is definitely not happy and lucky, because Rachel still hasn't borne any children of her own. And now we get to where things get a little weird in verse 14. Now, in the days of the wheat harvest, Reuben, who was the firstborn of Leah, who at this point would be about 8 or 9 years old, Reuben went out and was playing in the field and found some mandrakes. And a mandrake is a wildflower plant that grows in that area. It has little blue flowers. And if you pull it up, it has a root that looks like a carrot, basically, but it tends to be a bulbous, misshapen root. And in that time, it was thought to look like a man's luggage, right? And so the idea was that the mandrake root was an aphrodisiac and was a superstitious way for a barren woman to conceive, was to boil and eat of these mandrake roots. So Reuben finds some of this essentially Spanish fly in the field, and he brings it to his mother Leah. And Rachel said, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Is it a small matter for you to take my husband, and would you take my son's mandrakes also?" So Rachel said, "I'll tell you what, I'll make you a deal." And she drips with sarcasm in her deal. Rachel says, "He may lie with you tonight in return for your mandrakes." Now, what does that tell us? Number one, it says that at this point, Leah had been essentially cut off, because Rachel is obviously in control of what Jacob does. His calendar and his life are decidedly out of Leah's hands and into Rachel's hands. Secondly, it says that she's negotiating for her husband as stud. Essentially, she's trading mandrakes for a night in the fantasy suite, right? And that's just weird. And what's funny to me about it is in verse 16 how Jacob responds. Poor Jacob is out working. He has no idea that this whole negotiation's gone on. So when Jacob came in from the field in the evening, then Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come in to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes." So put yourself for a second in poor Joseph's shoes, right? Joseph's out working in the field. He comes home from work. He hits the door, and the first thing he's told is, "You've been hired for stud." And Jacob has no response other than, "All right." It just tells you a little bit about Jacob and who's running the family. Verse 17, "And God gave heed to Leah," who apparently wasn't done having children after all, "and she conceived, and she bore Jacob a fifth son. And Leah named him something very amusing. She named him wages. God has given me my wages because I hired him." So in other words, Issachar basically means I got what I paid for. Leah, who in those first 3 sons' names was really plaintive and sad and looking for Jacob's attention and approval, you can see how much she's changed, because she has a kid here and then what she names him is downright sassy. Then she does it again in verse 19, "And Leah conceived again and bore a 6th son to Jacob. And Leah said, God has endowed me with a good gift. Now my husband will dwell with me because I have borne him 6 sons. And so she named him Zebulun. And Zebulun basically means dwell in honor. In other words, I am in no longer any danger of being abandoned because I have turned out 6 boys, 6 male descendants. And then finally, she has a daughter in verse 21. Afterward, she bore a daughter and named her Dinah. That's what daughters got in that day and age. Sorry about that. And then in verse 22, Rachel, who was unfortunately obviously wrong about the mandrakes, because 3 more years have gone by and nothing has come of it, now Rachel finally gets in on it. Verse 22, then God remembered Rachel, and God gave heed to her and opened her womb. And she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she named him a name that was not only appreciation but also prophecy to an extent. The name Joseph means, may he add to me another son. So what she said is, she named him Joseph, add to me, and assumed by that she wasn't done having children. And lo and behold, it turned out she was right. She's going to end up later on having another child, Benjamin. So at this point, at the end of verse 24, Jacob now has 11 sons and the 1 daughter, and we're on with the story. So he and this passel of children now have to build for him a portfolio, have to build for him some level of wealth. And so the next section from the middle of chapter 30 on through into chapter 31 is Jacob essentially developing his own wealth, his own herds, which of course is the Middle Eastern equivalent of having a bank account. At this point, in verse 25, now it came about when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said to Laban, send me away that I may go to my own place and to my own country, and give me my wives and my children for whom I served you, and let me depart. For you yourself know the service which I have tendered you. Now, why does he want to leave? He wants to leave because he's been a hired hand, and he wants to go out and make his own way in the world, which is a reasonable thing to do. And at this point, he has been in the land for a long time, about 14 to 20 years, and it's time for him to leave. First of all, because that God had promised him that he would come back to Canaan. Secondly, because he thinks Esau is now out of the way, having moved far southwest to Edom, or to the Mount Seir is what it says, S-E-I-R, which is the mountain at the center of Edom, a land of the south. And so he thinks he's far enough away to not be a threat. But then the other reason he wants to move away is because he has been a favored like a son to Laban. But during the time that's gone on that he's been there, Laban has had a bunch of his own sons. And now there's some jealousy involved that we're going to find out about, where his sons aren't real keen on sharing their inheritance with Jacob, because Jacob isn't really one of the family as far as they see it. So he comes to Laban and he says, I want to go. But Laban says, verse 27, if now it pleases you, stay with me, for I have divined that the Lord has blessed me. I have noticed that the Lord has blessed me on your account. And he continued, name me your wages and I'll give it. In other words, Laban's not ready to let him go, not because he cares one way or the other about Jacob, but because he seems to do a lot better when Jacob is around. And so Jacob said to him, you yourself know how I've served you and how your cattle have fared with me, for you had little before I came, and it's increased to a multitude, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I turned. But now, when shall I provide for my own household? Again, it's my turn to start to do something for myself and my family. And verse 31, Laban says, what shall I give you? And Jacob said, you shall not give me anything. If you'll do this one thing for me, I will again pasture and keep your flock. And he tells him his plan. And the plan is a little strange, but we'll discuss that more in a second. Jacob basically makes this offer to him. He says in verse 32, let me pass through your entire flock today, removing from there every sheep that's speckled and every sheep that's spotted, and every black lamb. If you wonder, by the way, this is where the term black sheep comes from. Why we talk about somebody being the black sheep of the family, it comes from this verse. Everyone that is not speckled and spotted among the goats or black among the lambs, if found with me, will be considered stolen. And Laban said, good, let it be according to your word. So here's his idea. Purebred animals were thought to be pure color. If one came out and it was multicolored, if it was speckled, if it was striped, it was assumed to be of an inferior grade. So basically what Jacob's saying is, From here on out, as I'm tending your flock, you keep all the grade A, top-notch, top-shelf animals and give me the ones that are inferior. Gives me the ones that are spotted, gives me the ones that are speckled, give me the ones with defects, give me the ones that aren't quite right, give me the irregular animals, and I'll be satisfied with that, and you keep all the good ones. And Laban seems satisfied with that, but he turns around and immediately tries to stack the deck. Verse 35, so Laban removed on that day the striped and spotted goats and all the speckled and spotted female goats, everyone with white in it, and all the black ones among the sheep. And he gave them into the care of his sons. And he put a distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of the flocks. So Jacob goes out the next morning, having shaken on this agreement, and he looks, and every single animal is purebred one color. And he thinks, I've been had again, right? Because Laban, ever the con man, assumes that only striped and spotted animals are going to give striped and spotted offspring. So if he gets all of those animals and takes them away, then Jacob's not going to be able to get any more animals. Jacob's not going to give up that easily. And so he tries to one-up the deception of Laban by engaging in what was a superstition or an old wives' tale of animal husbandry of the day. It says in verse 37, and this is one of those passages that when you read modern criticisms of Scripture, this is one of the passages where they say, see, it's a bunch of weird, wacky, magical superstition. It has nothing to do with science. That's why we can't believe that the Bible is real. That's why it must be a bunch of made-up myths and fairy tales, because this sort of thing doesn't work. And let me read it, and then I want to just comment on that for a second. Then Jacob took fresh rods of poplar and almond and plane trees, and he peeled the bark until there were white stripes in the sticks, right? And he exposed the white which was in the rods, and he set the rods which he had peeled into the water troughs in front of the flocks. So when the flocks would come up to drink, they would mate while facing these sticks that were striped that had been put into the water troughs in front of them. So it would be kind of like if you were trying to get a particular gender of child, and you decided to mate in your bedroom with a television on. If it was on The Notebook, you'd get a girl, and if it was on Monster Trucks, you'd get a boy, all right? And that was basically the idea, is whatever you were seeing when this happened was going to influence what kind of child you'd have. That was the idea. He would wait until the animals were mating, and he would pipe in the gladiator theme. So the flocks mated by the rods, and the flocks brought forth striped, speckled, and spotted, and Jacob separated the lambs and made the flocks face toward the striped and all the black in the flock of Laban, and he put his own herds apart and didn't put them with Laban's flock. And it came about that whenever the stronger of the flock were mating, that Jacob would place the rods where the flock could see them, so that they might mate by the rods. But when the flock was feeble, if weak animals were mating, he would hide the rods, and he wouldn't show them. So the feebler became Laban's, his flock became weaker and weaker, and Jacob's flock became stronger and stronger. Now, is the Bible saying that Jacob's cool superstition idea worked? Maybe, maybe not. Two possibilities I've found. One is the most obvious, that God worked out his will for Jacob regardless and in coincidence to the superstition, and that the superstition had nothing to do with it. But there was a second long commentary on this passage by a rabbi, actually, which was really fascinating, because he looked at the science behind this. And believe it or not, there is some. He said that Laban's assumption was that solid-colored animals couldn't bear striped or spotted offspring. Yet we know that recessive genes are expressed all the time, and the way to get recessive genes out is to concentrate the recessive genes by crossbreeding them. And that ultimately what he may have been doing was selecting for the recessive gene of variegated coat color. Also, the sticks, the poplar and the almond and the plane tree, which they think is a type of birch found in that area, that they actually have, and this was kind of funny to me, that they have documented health benefits, anti-inflammatory properties, kind of like if you peel willow bark and you suck on it. The Indians figured out that their headache went away, and it turned out to be where aspirin came from. Acetylsalicylic acid is found in the bark of willow, and so if you chew on willow bark, you actually are getting aspirin. Or the people in Ethiopia that we found, that they told us the story in the Gofo region of Ethiopia, that they would chew on the seeds of this plant, and then they would get a whole lot of work done. And it turned out that it became to be known as kaffe, and eventually became coffee. Well, they were chewing on coffee beans, and they were getting jacked up on Mountain Dew, and then going out and being really productive. And nobody realized that it was that there was caffeine in what they were chewing on. Well, the idea is, how do you release the effects of the bark of these trees? You peel it off in strips and you soak it in water. It's kind of interesting. So what he may have been doing is kind of like we put antibiotic into animal feed, or we put growth hormones or proteins or nutritives into animal feed, and the animals get stronger and bigger. It may have been that Jacob, without realizing it, or without realizing it was doing that, or that some of these old wives' tales actually they had observed over time and found that this actually did make a difference. Who knows? So God may have worked a miracle. He may have used natural means. In any event, the result was the same. Again, verse 43, so the man became exceedingly prosperous and got large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys. So things are looking up in Jacob land. He's wealthy, he's got the birthright, he's got the blessing, he's got a flock, he's got a passel of kids, but there's trouble, and the trouble arrives in the form of jealousy from Laban's family. 31, verse 1. So Jacob heard the words of Laban's sons, who were murmuring to themselves, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what belonged to our father he has made all this wealth. So Jacob must have cheated our father out of all of these animals that he now has. We're looking at Jacob. Jacob's wealthy. We know what kind of person Jacob is. He must have done something wrong to our dad to do this. And Jacob senses that Laban feels cheated. Verse 2, Jacob saw the attitude of Laban, and behold, it was not friendly toward him as before. There's an understatement. So the Lord came to Jacob, and he said, go back, return to the land of your fathers, return to your relatives. And again, he repeats that same promise he had made at the time of Jacob's ladder in Bethel. I will be with you. So Jacob, in verse 4, realizes he wants to go back. He wants to go back home, but he needs the support of his wife and family. So in verse 4 to 13, and we won't read the whole thing, but basically what he does is he recounts or recaps the past few years of what has happened, and he finishes up in verse 13 with, I am the God, that God came to him and said, I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar, where you made a vow to me. Now arise, leave this land, and return to the land of your birth. So Jacob basically sells his case to his 4 wives and says, we need to go back to Bethel. We need to leave this land. We need to go back to Canaan, where my father is. And I need you all to agree with this, because the last thing in the world he wants to travel with is 4 women who don't want to be there. And they immediately agree. Verse 14. And Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, do we still have any portion or inheritance in our father's house? Are we not reckoned by him as foreigners? For he has sold us and has entirely consumed our purchase price, our dowry. Surely all of the wealth which God has taken away from our father belongs to us and our children. So do whatever God has said to you. Rachel and Leah agree with Jacob that their father basically has it out for them. They feel entitled to whatever they leave town with, and they're ready to follow. So in the dead of night, they run away. Verse 17. Jacob arose and put his children and his wives upon camels, and he drove away all his livestock and all his property which he had gathered, his acquired livestock which he had gathered in Paddan Aram, to go to the land of Canaan to his father Isaac. And when Jacob had gone to shear his flock, then Rachel stole the household gods that were her father's. We'll come back to that in a second. And Jacob deceived, again that word, Jacob Laban, by not telling him that he was fleeing. So he fled with all that he had, and he arose and crossed the Euphrates River and set his face toward the hill country of Gilead, which is right in the center of Canaan, right in the center of Israel. So basically, it seems that Jacob is doing something to Laban from verse 20 when it says Jacob deceived Laban the Aramean. Apparently, the term says that he stole Laban's heart, that Laban did care about his kids, that Laban did want the chance to say goodbye, that Laban did want the chance to send them off, and Jacob doesn't give him that. He sneaks away in the dead of night with everything he's got, and his daughter seems to have learned how to cheat and steal as well. She steals the household gods, which, what were they? They were the symbol in the pagan culture of fertility and blessing on the house. So basically, she's taking the good luck charm. She's taking the lucky charm from the house. In a way, she's stolen the blessing from her father that she couldn't obtain fairly, which is essentially what Jacob did. So they're two of a kind. And they're off in a hurry. They cover 400 miles in about 10 days with 12 small children and 4 wives on a bunch of camels. They cover 40 miles a day. That's moving right along. But Laban goes even faster. Verse 22, when it was told Laban on the 3rd day that Jacob had fled, he took his kinsmen with him, so he takes a small army, and he pursues him a distance of 7 days' journey, and he overtook him in the hill country of Gilead. So he covers that 400 miles and makes up the 3-day head start in a week. And obviously, he's come to take them, at least take his daughters and grandchildren back. But God has other plans. Verse 24, and God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream of the night and said to him, be careful that you do not speak to Jacob either good or bad. That is a Hebrew figure of speech that means don't try to bribe him. Don't try to convince him. Don't try to twist his arm. In other words, this is of me, let him go. And Laban gets the message. Laban caught up with Jacob, and Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country, and Laban with his kinsmen were camped in the hill country of Gilead. And Laban comes to Jacob, and he says, why did you take my daughters away in the dead of night? Why did you flee secretly and deceive me and didn't tell me, so that I might have sent you away with joy and with songs and with a celebration, basically that I could have given you a going away party? He's okay with letting them go, but what he says is, verse 30, and now you have indeed gone away because you longed greatly for your father's house, but why did you steal my gods? What we see is Laban's okay now with letting him go, but he still wants his household lucky charm back because, remember, he was doing really well when Jacob was there. And that's why he didn't want Jacob to leave in the first place. He said, as long as you were here, I've done great. If you leave, Yahweh, the lucky charm, is gone. I better get my household gods back because I got to have something. Well, Jacob has no idea that he has the household gods. And Jacob, verse 31, says, I was afraid because I thought you would take your daughters from me by force, and that's why I left in the night. But I'll tell you what, I didn't steal your gods. I didn't steal your little idols. Whoever took your gods shall not live. In the presence of your kinsmen, point out what's yours among my belongings. In other words, I didn't steal anything that belonged to you, including your gods. Take a look. Look around the tent. And so you can feel this like a movie, the tension building as he looks through. So it says, so Laban went into Jacob's tent, and he looked around, no gods. And he went into Leah's tent, and he looked around, still no gods. And he went into the tents of the 2 maids, and still no gods. He didn't find them. Then he went out of Leah's tent, and he entered Rachel's tent. And you can hear the da-da-da-da, because he's about to find the gods, right? Well, Rachel is as clever as Jacob is. It says, Rachel had taken the household gods, and she had put them in the saddle of her camel, and she sat on them. And Laban felt all through the tent, and he didn't find them. And he said, get up off the camel, I want to search the camel. And what does Rachel do? She says to her father, let not my lord be angry that I cannot rise before you, for the manner of women is upon me. Now, when I was in Cuba years ago and we were trying to get cigars back into the country, We were told, here's how you hide cigars from customs back in that day. Now you don't have to because you can get them in legally, but in that day, put them in a tampon box because no male customs official will ever look in a tampon box. All men are basically terrified of whatever is going on down there, right? And Laban is one of those guys. So Laban's like, oh, okay, you stay on the camel, that's great. And he never looks because he says, whatever's going on there, I don't want any part of it. And he searched, but he did not find the household idols. So in verse 36, Jacob, from 36 to 42, and again, I don't want to read the whole thing. From 36 to basically 32, basically from 36 to 42. He goes off on this rant, and he says, I told you I didn't steal your gods. I didn't have your gods. Here you are. I worked for you for 20 years. I never slept. I worked in the heat. I worked without air conditioning. He says it right here. These 20 years I have been with you, and there I was, verse 40, by day the heat consumed me, and the frost by night consumed me, and my sleep fled from my eyes. And all of this I've done for you, and the only thanks I get is that you accuse me of being a thief. Well, what Jacob doesn't realize is he actually was a thief, but he has no idea. Laban is beaten, and he knows it. And so in verse 43, Laban says, after Jacob goes on his extended rant, Laban answers and says to Jacob, the daughters are my daughters, and the children are my children, and the flocks are my flocks, and all that you see is mine. But what can I do this day? I'm not going to fight you for them. I'm not going to drag them back. So you go ahead. Verse 44. So come and let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me. And so at a place called Mizpah, which will become more important going forward, and if you remember when we studied a few years ago the book of Judges, there were several covenants that were taken at Mizpah. It became the place where you made agreements, kind of like the Camp David where you would make accords in that day. And this is where it began to be that place. This is where that custom came from, is in verses 43 to 54. They make a heap of stones, build a rock altar, and they make promises and oaths between them not to cross over in anger or violence against one another. So Jacob says, me and my descendants will not cross over and attack you. And Laban says, me and my descendants will not cross over and attack you. And they seal the deal the way you seal deals in the Middle East, which is that in verse 54, Jacob offers a sacrifice on the mountain and called his kinsmen to the meal, and they ate the meal and spent the night on the mountain. So they make this agreement between themselves. Jacob, it's interesting in verse 53 that Jacob swears by the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of Laban's father. May that God judge between us. And Jacob swore by whom? The fear of his father Isaac. He swears by Isaac's God. And that'll be important at the end tonight. So they make this agreement. They seal the deal with a meal. They seal it with the secret handshakes. And then in verse 55, early in the morning, Laban arose and kissed his sons and his daughters and blessed them. And then Laban departed and returned to his place. So that is basically the big preamble tonight. And where do we find Jacob at that point? So the next piece is going to be Jacob's come to Jesus story, and that's what we're going to spend pretty much the rest of the night on. But where Jacob is at this point is he is wealthy. He has a passel of kids, which is how you measure success in that society, a whole collection of big strapping boys. He has 4 wives who get along to varying sorts. He has peace with his main enemy, Laban. He has just negotiated this peace that he feels comfortable in. He's on his way back to his father's home. Esau, he assumes, is out of the picture. And so Jacob is living large. Jacob is at a point where he is truly the master of his fate. He's the captain of his soul. He has got it together, and Jacob finally is feeling like big, confident stuff, right? Again, this is where Jacob needs to get the wind knocked out of him. Chapter 32, verse 1, as Jacob went on his way, the angels of God met him. And Jacob said when he saw them, "This is God's camp." So it's kind of a weird, cryptic verse. Jacob names the camp Mahanaim, which means two companies. So it doesn't give us any detail about it, but somehow Jacob comes upon this group of men, this company of men, whose appearance and manner convinces him that they are supernatural. And he assumes that they're on his side. So he's got everything going for him. He is at a point where he can be nothing but confident because he has angels. Remember what we said about what angels are like, that have met him and been with him, and he feels like this is all going well. And yet, he's about to get punched with his biggest fear. The next verse tells us why. Verse 3. Then Jacob sent messengers before him to his brother Esau in the south country, in the land of Seir, which is the mountain in Edom. It's kind of like they use as a euphemism for Israel, Mount Zion, because that's one of the main mountains in the center of Jerusalem. Mount Seir and Edom are basically the mountain and the country around the mountain, for what it's worth. They're synonymous. So Jacob sent messengers before him to his brother Esau. Why? Because he's going to say, I have been away for a really long time, and it's all good between us, right? It's all good. Bygones, bygones. Sorry about the blessing, but please don't kill me when I come home. And he's letting him know he's on his way. And he commanded them, saying, Thus shall you say to my lord Esau, Thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban, and I have stayed until now, and I have oxen and donkeys and flocks and male and female servants, and I have sent to tell my lord that I may find favor in your sight. In other words, I am now rich and powerful, and you have every reason in the world to fear me or to at least respect me. So I'm coming back, Esau, but you better not mess with me because I'm now big stuff, right? And the messengers returned to Jacob and said, We came to your brother Esau, and we told him your little message, and he sent back this severed head. We came to your brother Esau, and furthermore, he is now coming to meet you with 400 men. And the assumption is that Esau has gone down to Edom, and he has created a militia of hairy-chested, camo-wearing dudes, and now 400 of them are coming to let Jacob know how Esau feels about him coming back home. So in verse 7, it goes without saying, Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. No kidding. Jacob, his biggest idol, the biggest thing that he thought, this is what I depend on, is what? His self-sufficiency. I can do this. I can connive my way out of anything. I can build myself a strength. I can do this on my own. And that's the idol that God's got to knock down. And at this point, he's got this passel of kids, and he's got flocks, and he's got herds, and he's got a bunch of stuff. But it's not going to do him one bit of good against this bad mamma jamma with 400 people who are coming to tear him up, right? So Jacob is greatly afraid and distressed, and he does what Jacob does. He tries to manage the problem. Verse 7, And he divided the people who were with him, and the flocks and the herds and the camels, into two companies. So he's doing a pretty decent military strategy, for he said, if Esau comes to the one company and attacks it, then the other company will escape. So at least I'll get away with half my stuff and half my people. And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, Return to your country and to your relatives, and I will prosper you, I am unworthy of all that you have shown to your servant. For with my staff only I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become two full companies. Thanks for all of it, God, but remember that saying, there are no atheists in foxholes? Do me a favor, please, Lord, verse 11, and deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he come and attack me, the mothers with the children. That's it, bring up the mothers and children. Try to suck up to God's compassion. And for thou didst say, you did tell me, surely I will prosper you, and I will make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. And if they all get wiped out by Esau, that whole sand of the sea thing is right out the window, God. So if you do me a huge favor, I could really use you helping me out here. He's exhausting every option. So he's going to try bribery. Verse 13. So he spent the night there. Then he selected from what he had with him a present for his brother Esau. 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milking camels and their colts, 40 cows, 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys, and 10 male donkeys. Think of how much he had that was a present out of his flocks. This guy had done pretty darn well. And in verse 16, he delivered them into the hands of his servants, every drove by itself, and he said to his servants, pass on before me and put a space between the droves. So bring some of the animals, and then let there be a space, and then bring some more animals, and let there be a space, and bring some more animals. And what's he doing? It's essentially a parade of gifts. It's like in Aladdin. Sorry, everything goes back to Disney for me. It's the Aladdin parade of a float, and then a float, and then a float. And he's trying to overwhelm Esau with these gifts so that Esau will finally say, let's not kill him after all. And he commanded also the second, and then he said, he commanded the one in front, saying, when my brother Esau meets you and says, to whom do you belong, and where are you going, and what are these animals in front of you, to whom do they belong? And you shall say, these belong to your servant Jacob. It's a present sent to my lord Esau. And behold, he also is behind us. So Jacob's coming, but first he wants you to have all this stuff. And then he said also to the second and the third and to those who followed the droves, saying, after this manner shall you speak, and you shall say, behold, your servant Jacob also is behind us. For he said, verse 20, I will appease him with the present that goes before me, and then afterward I will see his face, and perhaps he will accept. So the present passed on before him, while he himself spent the night in the camp. And he arose that same night, and here's the last thing he's going to do. He's going to send what's most dear to him. He took his 2 wives and his 2 maids and his 11 children and crossed the ford of the Jabbok River. So he crosses over a river. And he took them and sent them across the stream, and he sent across whatever he had. And then the key verse, verse 24, then Jacob was left alone. The Hebrew word there is a Hebrew word meaning separated, like a tree branch or like an amputated body part. Jacob was separated or severed from everything else he had. And that's exactly where God wants him. Because think about it. If you're really distressed, if you've really come to that end of your rope and you're genuinely afraid, what's the last thing you really want? Solitude, time to think. What you really want to do is you want to stay busy. You want lots of stuff around. Jacob, why is this important? Because Jacob has this deep need, remember, for validation. He has this vacuum inside him, and he has been trying to meet it with all of those things that Father Jeff talks about, with prestige, with possessions, with power. He's been trying to build himself up to the point that he will fill this emptiness, this idea that he can't do it on his own, this idea of not feeling worthy. And he has tried love, and he has tried power, and he's tried prosperity, and he's conned, and he's cheated, and he's manipulated, and still that hole inside him remains. So this point where Jacob has sent his stuff on ahead, and he's sent his wives on ahead, and he's sent his children on ahead, and he's standing there terrified in the middle of the night all by himself alone, not knowing whether he's going to live through the next day, right? That's where God wants him. And at that point, what the AA folks would call rock bottom, this is where God has his intervention, because this strange thing happens. Someone, a man who is quite obviously God, a supernatural man, comes to wrestle with him. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. And when he saw that and we're just going to read the whole story. And when the man saw that he had not prevailed against him, he touched the socket of Jacob's thigh, right in the hip joint. So the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated while he wrestled with him. So all night long, this man wrestles with him for hours. And after hours, when the man sees that he's not going to shake Jacob off, he touches the hip joint, and the thigh is dislocated. He dislocates his hip. And then he said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What's your name?" And he said, "Jacob." And he said, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob. Your name shall be Israel. For you have striven with God and with men, and you have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him and said, "Please tell me your name." But the man said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And he blessed him there. So Jacob named the place Peniel, for he said, "I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been spared." And the sun rose upon him as he crossed over Peniel, and he was limping on his thigh. So, what do you learn from this story? There's many ways to approach it. It's one of the big stories in the Old Testament. The story of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, and then this story of Jacob wrestling with God are two of those seminal stories that carry a whole lot of weight and value going forward throughout the Old Testament. And so I'll confess, I've rewritten this. Poor Melody has watched me rewrite this section like 3 or 4 different times. She never wants to know what's coming, so she doesn't know where we ended up. But she has heard me say, "No, I have to go rewrite lesson 4 again." But I finally decided the best way to approach this is the way that they taught it in journalism class, which is to kind of look at the who, the what, the when, the where, the why. And I think a lot of them are tied up together as we think about Jacob and how he is as he's standing there on that riverbank. Because again, we know he spent his whole life trying to measure up. We know that he is insecure. We know that he's anxious. And we know that anybody like that, from our own personal experience, lives in great fear of one thing, and that is being found out. Everything crashing down, of knowing you're an imposter and knowing that it could all come crashing down at any moment. And now he is about to come the next day face to face with his past. He's going to come face to face with Esau, who he conned and deceived, who wants to kill him. And if he makes it through that, he's going to come face to face with Isaac, who he deceived and who probably isn't real thrilled about it. And he knows that he's doomed. He knows he's afraid. And if you remember when Jacob was destitute and he was sleeping on a rock, that God came to him to comfort him. This time, God shows up again when he's at that point of need again. But this time, he comes as an intervention. And what do you know about an intervention? It's usually not pleasant. Seldom does the person, if you know anything about the AA concept of an intervention, where you get together with a person and you try to convince them of what? That their life has become unlivable, that they can't do it on their own, and that they need help. Most of the time, people don't respond to that by saying, "Thanks. You know, you're right. I do need help. I really appreciate you pointing that out to me." That's not how anybody responds to an intervention. The way they typically respond is, "This isn't fair. I do not. I'm doing fine," right? And what do? They wrestle. They fight back. And the passage doesn't tell us. It just says, verse 24, that the man came and wrestled with Jacob till daybreak. But the fight had to start somewhere, right? You don't start with just standing on the riverbank and taking a swing at somebody. So I sat there and I tried to imagine how this would have started. And there's really 2 ways fights start. Either one, the person starting the fight is showing off for someone. Well, you got to figure God probably didn't have any ladies he was showing off for, so that's probably not it. The other is that you poke, you pick at him, right? That's how I'm missing most of a front tooth because of a fight in junior high. It was with my best friend. About 5 minutes after the fight, he was my best friend again because I'm a man and we're that way. And I remember as I was holding the part of my tooth and walking down to the nurse's office, and he was walking with me because the principal's office was right next door. And he said to me, his name was Mark Sullivan, he was Irish, never mouth off to an Irish kid. That's like should be rules. And he said, you know, you asked for that. And I said, yeah, I kind of did. I remember that. I remember telling him, yeah, I kind of did ask for it. Well, I believe, this is pure speculation, but I like to think that it started with this man, Jacob's sitting there all by himself, and he's kind of, you know, depressed and frightened and moping there in the dark. And some guy comes up and says, hey, what you doing here by the river in the dark, all by yourself at midnight? You know, what you doing here so late? And Jacob says something like nothing. And he eventually wears him down, and Jacob kind of tells him the story. Well, you know, I'm going to go meet my brother. Oh, yeah, that's awesome. Well, not for me, because there was this time, and I, you know, cheated him out of, cheated him out of what? Cheated him out of his, his entire inheritance, birthright, and everything that mattered to him in the world. Huh, dude, you're screwed. You know, I mean, you can just see this. And Jacob's like, no, I've got this. You know, I can do something about it. And he's like, yeah, sure, I bet you will. Kind of like you figured out, you know, the birthright blessing thing. Yeah, good luck with that. And I think he needled him and he picked at him, and finally Jacob takes a swing at him, and then he pushes him back, and then Jacob grabs him, and all of a sudden they're in this wrestling match. And I think that argument and Jacob feeling belittled and Jacob feeling like maybe I don't have this all together and this man pointing it out is where all of a sudden they end up in this, you know, wrestling match. And the word they use for wrestling there is interesting. It is not the same word as Naphtali that they named the kid. I have wrestled and I have prevailed, Naphtali. This is a different word. This is a word that refers to a much, much, much more violent struggle. It's kind of like the fights in The Matrix, where they throw the guy across the wall and he goes through the drywall and they break bricks and stuff, you know, break a car over someone. The word literally means to crush something to dust. So they're in a serious fight. I mean, this is not a little pushing, slapping, sissy, shoving match. This is a serious, I want to kill you, full-on Matrix holes in the drywall stuff fight. And we also know that this is not a fair fight. Why? Because Jacob is Mr. Hairless Soft Hands, right? And he's fighting the God of the universe. This is not going to end well. And it made me think of a game that we used to play, and I think my dad's going to listen to this later, so he'll get a kick out of this. But there was a game, this is not anything he puts on his application for Father of the Year. When we were like 3, 4, 5 years old, we had a game that we used to play routinely, and we would want to play it. Dad, can we play Scrapperdack? Dad, can we play Scrapperdack? And what Scrapperdack was, and this is really going to sound like child abuse, but we really wanted to play it. He would sit cross-legged on the floor, and he would take the cushions off the couch, and he would line them up like a runway in front of him. And we, at 2, 3, 4 years old, would toddle unsteadily up the cushions, and he would sit silent, and he would pretend like he was asleep or not noticing us, and he would not move. And then all of a sudden, when we got close enough, he would go, Scrapperdack, and he would knock us on our butts. He would just shove us on these pillows. And we thought that was we'd giggle and we'd roll around, and he would go back into his silent. And we'd play Scrapperdack for like as long as he could put up with it. It felt like forever to us. It was probably 10 minutes. But we loved this game of Scrapperdack, right? Now, I'm pretty sure that Dad could have won Scrapperdack really quickly if he'd wanted to, right? Pick up the kid, go Scrapperdack, and throw him across the room, and the game's over. Right? But God doesn't do that. Why? It was important for the game to continue that Dad didn't use all his strength. The game here is not for God to beat Jacob. The game, what God wants is relationship. And if God uses all his strength, he's going to incinerate Jacob. And then there's no relationship. And that's not what God's after. What God wants is for them to engage. And so how do you wrestle a toddler? You don't use all your strength. Philippians chapter 2 says, have this same attitude in you that was in Christ Jesus, who did not consider equality with God something to be held on to, but emptied himself and made himself of no reputation and became a servant and became obedient even unto death. God here condescends to Jacob and says, I will tie one arm behind my back and I'll fight with none of my strength so that we can engage as quote-unquote equals. You, the little toddler, and me, the God of the universe. Why? Because I want to spend this time together. Why did Dad decide not to knock us on our butts? Because the point of the game was to tussle and hug and wrestle and spend time with Dad. And that's what is going on here. But then we come to this point of the morning, and God says in verse 26, then he said, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. What was significant about daybreak? It has been all night. It's time. It's time to face the music. The morning is here. This is that day you talked about. And it's time for, the sun is coming up, and it's time to go meet Esau. And this light goes on for Jacob because he realizes he can't do this by himself. And it's interesting what he says. I won't let you go until what? Until you bless me. And remember what we said about a blessing? What was it? A blessing is the speaking of spiritually discerned words of affirmation and encouragement over you and into your soul by someone whose opinion you value, by someone whose opinion can transform you. What Jacob is saying is, I've met that person who can speak that blessing into me. He says, I've been using God as a means to an end. Remember that prayer he had after Jacob's ladder at Bethel? If you do all this stuff for me, then I'll come back and I'll be yours. I'll wear your t-shirt and I'll give you 10%. Now what he's saying is, you need to bless me or I ain't going anywhere. And God makes him do the hardest thing. He says, tell me your name. What is your name? That statement in the ancient world was this huge pregnant statement. What did it mean to tell someone your name? We catch a little bit of it in a fairy tale, the fairy tale of Rumpelstiltskin, where they have to guess his name in order to have control over him. That comes from this ancient cultural idea that in your name was your nature, your character, your essence, who you were. And Jacob says, tell me your name. And Jacob says, I'm Jacob. I'm that one who clutches, who grasps, who tries to deceive. I'm a con man. I'm the one who scrambles for approval. That's what's in his name. And what does God answer? No, that's not your name. Your name isn't going to be deceiver anymore. Your name is going to be Israel, the one who fights with God, the one who struggles with God, the one who engages on a deep, intimate level with God. He basically changes his name from sneaky to warrior. And think of what that does for Jacob. No longer is Jacob going to trust in himself, in his conning, in his conning, in his conning, and his craftiness. What he's going to do is he's going to hold tight onto God, and God says, that's who you'll be from here on forward, the one who engages with me. Jacob needs to know exactly what that blessing means. So you see what Jacob does next? He says, well, what is your name? And what he's saying is, who are you? What is your essence? Am I right that you are the one? And what God answers is the only way he can answer. If you remember in the story of Samson in Judges, the angel of the Lord, which the context makes clear is the pre-incarnate Christ, the same as what is believed that this character is that Jacob's been wrestling with, Jesus Christ before he came to earth. before he was born of Mary. This is the pre-incarnate Christ. And the pre-incarnate Christ appears to Manoah and his wife and tells them that they're going to have a son, and that son's going to be named Samson, the guy with the long hair and all the muscles, right? And Manoah says, "Tell me your name." And he gets basically the same answer. He says, "You can't know my name because my name is too," and the word is Peled, "my name is too wonderful for you. My name is too awesome for you." It's Jack Nicholson. "You can't handle my name," is what he basically says. And here, God says the same thing. "You can't know my name, but I will give you my blessing. You can't handle my essence." And in that answer, Jacob knows exactly who it is. And it's clear that Jacob knows exactly who it is, because what does he say in verse 30? He named the place Penuel, for he said, "I have seen God face to face." So he knows exactly who that was. And just to make sure that Jacob never forgets it, God touches, and the word is a light tap. So they've been throwing each other across the room all night long, and then God at one point says, "Okay, it's time for me to get the upper hand." Boop. And he taps his hip, and it goes completely obliterated, which gives you a sense of how Scrapperdack could have ended up. And it is permanently damaged. Brennan Manning, the author, calls, in his book Ragamuffin Gospel, has a chapter called "The Victorious Limp," and it references this story. What he basically says is sometimes our scars are what God gives us to remind us of his presence and to remind us of these experiences. Jacob's going to carry around in his body the memorial of this experience. Remember throughout the Bible how the Israelites are always building monuments and memorials and remembering this and celebrating that. And the reason is God knows that we're a forgetful people and we need to continue to remember these things. For the Israelites to whom Moses is writing, they are people of these festivals and remembrances and monuments. Well, one of their festivals, one of their monuments or memorials, they reference in verse 32. Remember, Moses is writing this years later to the Israelite people, and he says, "Therefore, to this day, the sons of Israel do not eat the sinew of the hip which is in the socket of the thigh." Why? Because it reminds them of this story. You as a people are the ones who engage with God. You are the ones who wrestle with God. The source of every time they kill an animal and every time they eat it, they throw away this little piece and they remember God is where their strength and their hope and their value comes from. The blessing of God on this day, on their forefather. So what did Jacob take from this experience? In verse 30, Jacob, it says, is amazed because I saw God face to face and he didn't kill me. And what is he amazed by? Well, I think part of what he's amazed by is, remember, Jacob's default position has been to fake it, to pretend to be more than Jacob really is, to try to prove to God or prove to those around him how great he was, how smart he was, how successful he was, because he was trying to put up that wall and prove himself. The one person you can't really prove yourself to is the creator of the universe, right? And so here, what Jacob is saying is, God saw me face to face. And what that Hebrew euphemism means is, as I really am. Naked. God saw Jacob for exactly who Jacob was. And instead of saying, you're a cheat, you're a liar, you're a thief, you're a deceiver, and killing him, what God says is, and I bless you. What does that do to somebody? That's transformative blessing. When you didn't have to dress up in goat skins and pretend to be Esau to get blessed. When instead you said, I am this slimy, sneaky dude, and God says, and you will be mine, and I'll love you, and I'll bless you. And Jacob realizes that. God has seen him with all his faults, and God has said, anyway, I love you and I'll be with you. And it changes completely how Jacob responds to Esau. So it's 8:10. If I can have about 10 more minutes, I want to just show you real quick. Is everybody good with that? And if anybody wants to leave, you will not offend me. But I want to show you real quick at the beginning of chapter 33 how this changes his interaction with Esau. And we'll go really quick with this. So Jacob lifted up his eyes, and he looked, and remember, he's dragging his mangled hip and leg behind him. And behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men in camo. And he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the two maids, and he put the maids and their children in front, and Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph last, still showing favoritism. And he himself passed on ahead of them. Remember, he was going to send them all ahead of him, and he was going to bring up the rear? You can do what you want to the girls, just leave me alone. Instead, he flips it. Now he's going to go meet Esau. Immediate change in who he is. And he passed on ahead of them, and he bowed down to the ground 7 times, and he came near to his brother. And Esau ran to meet him, and Esau's response is stunning. Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And he lifted up his eyes and saw the women and the children and said, "Who are these?" And he said, "These are the children that God has given your servants." And the maids came near with their children, and they bowed down. And Leah likewise came near with her children, and Rachel, and they bowed down. And he said, "What do you mean by all of this company which I've met?" And Jacob says, "To find favor in the sight of my Lord." And Esau says, "I have plenty, my brother. Let what you have be your own." And Jacob said, and this is the key here, Jacob said, "No, if I have found favor in your sight, take my present from my hand, for I see your face as one sees the face of God, and you have received me favorably. Please take my gift which has been brought you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and I have plenty." The word for gift or tribute is actually the same word as blessing, and the way you conferred that blessing on someone was to bow down before them. Basically, what Jacob's doing here, he is acting like exactly the opposite of the captain and the master of his fate, the captain of his soul. What he's doing is he is saying, "I am willing to restore to you, Esau, what I cheated you out of." He is essentially giving him back his birthright, giving him back his blessing. He's saying, "I am not going to hold on to what I stole. It's yours if you want it." Now Esau responds by saying, "I don't want it. Take it. It's all yours. I don't need it. I'm good." But it's powerful that Jacob walks into this setting basically saying, "I am no longer going to hold on to any of this," which is exactly the opposite of what Jacob was before. Then in verse 12, then Esau said, "Let us take our journey and go, and I'll go before you." And Jacob said, "Please know that my children are frail, and the flocks and herds which you're nursing are a care to me, and if they're driven hard one more day, all the flocks will die. So let my Lord pass on before his servant, and I'll proceed at leisure according to the pace of the cattle that are before me and according to the pace of the children." Basically, I'll go as slow as the kids want to go. "And I'll come see you in Edom." And Esau said, "Let me leave with you some of the people who are with me," kind of to help, attendants, servants, Sherpas to help carry your stuff. And Jacob said, "What need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord. I'm good, you go ahead." So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir, and Jacob journeyed to Succoth, and we'll get to that next week. But then finally, I want to end with verse 18 to 20, and just take a minute, because this is kind of our so what, if you will. So Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, and he camped before the city. And he erected there an altar, and he called it El Elohe Israel. So he comes into the promised land after this encounter with God and after this encounter with Esau. And what does he do? He builds an altar. And why do you build an altar? You always build an altar to declare yourself as something, specifically to declare yourself as separate from everything around you. And what is that altar named? And this is, I think, the so what of this story. The altar is named God, the God of Israel. What did he call God before when he made his covenant with Laban? The God of Isaac, the fear of Isaac. Now it's the God of Israel. What's the dramatic thing that changed that night? It went from being Dad's faith to my faith. And that never changes. You never see Jacob deceive anybody out of anything again. Jacob never in the rest of the story cons anybody, cheats anybody. He's not perfect. Believe me, we're going to see that Jacob is still a crappy father, and Jacob is going to make all sorts of other mistakes, and he's going to whine like a Jewish grandmother. But what he is not going to do anymore is ride on the coattails of Isaac and Abraham's faith. Now he fears God. He doesn't fear Esau. He doesn't fear being found out. He doesn't fear insignificance. He fears God. And what does the Bible say over and over and over and over again in Proverbs, about 15 times? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. He was finally ready to be charity. He knew he was lost, and that's where he could be found. So basically, to me, the so what of this is very simple. And the Bible addresses this same question about 5 or 6 places. Probably the most famous one is at the end of Romans chapter 8. What are we afraid of? What do we fear? Do we fear that we'll be found out? Do we fear that we're not attractive enough, that we're not smart enough, that we're not successful enough? Do we fear that we've made some horrible mistake that God will never forgive? Do we fear the skeletons in our closet, that they'll be found out? What this story tells us is that what God is after is to engage with us. And Romans 8 puts it as well as anywhere in Scripture, where it says, "For I am convinced that neither life nor death, nor angels, nor the present, nor things to come, nor principalities, nor height, nor depth, nor anything in all creation can come between the love, can take away the love of God in Christ." We are loved as much as we will ever be loved, and there is nothing whatsoever we can do to make God not love us. And once we incorporate that into our soul, once we really get that, then no longer do we spin our wheels trying to fill that hole, right? Because we know where that value comes from, that validation. It comes from the fact that God said, "I'm a child of the King." So what is man? What can man do unto me? And that's where Jacob got to. And that, I think, is as much of a story that comes out of this as anything. So thank you for letting me go an extra 5 minutes. And next week, we will go on and find out once again that Jacob didn't have it all together. And we'll have one of those stories that you will never find in a coloring book in any children's Bible stories. There will be a few of those coming. So the next 3 weeks are interesting, and we might want to be on a 5-second delay. Eric. Let's pray. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, Lord, it feels weird to thank you that we are helpless, but we thank you that as soon as we grasp that we're helpless, that we have the power of the universe ready to step up and call us his children, and that you long to gather us under your wings and protect us and guide us and empower us to live eternally and to reign in your kingdom. We can't fathom it, but we can believe it, and we can thank you for it. And we pray that you will watch over us and bring us back next week, and we thank you for the truth and the glory in your word. In your name, amen.